Okay, welcome again. At the conclusion of this quiz, I want you to go through, I'm going to put up a short quiz that's not going to be graded on Google Classroom. So make sure you go on there and check that out and fill it out. There'll just be a couple of questions there I want you to answer. So make sure you do that for your credit for this video. So make sure you do that. What I'm going to talk about today is nutrient cycles and energy flow, and pertaining to an ecosystem. So we're moving into our ecosystems unit. This is kind of the first pieces of information that we're going to use. So two things we have to define, first of all, are nutrients and energy. Nutrients are things like elements or compounds that organisms in the ecosystem use to function, or they use them to create or use energy in their cells. And the important part about nutrients that you'll see today is that they cycle. They cycle in an ecosystem. Conversely, energy is produced from these chemical reactions in cells. So these two are related in that way, but energy flows in an ecosystem and can be used up, as you'll see as we go through this today. So the first part is on energy and how it flows through an ecosystem. So here's an example of a scenario. So we have the sun's rays, and the sun is the ultimate energy source for Earth and for all the organisms that live here. If we didn't have the sun, we wouldn't be living here today. So sun's rays come down and they hit the plants. And really the plants are the only organisms that can really absorb energy from the sun. Okay, we have solar cells and things like that, but those can't direct energy from the sun like plants can. Plants are very efficient at it, and they're the best things. So we call this process photosynthesis, where the sun's rays come in, they hit the plants absorb the energy, and they do some chemical reactions, which we'll get to later on in this course, but not at this point. So plants then store this energy. They get consumed by things like bunnies, animals, any other thing that eats the plants. And those organisms generally have body heat. So they give off energy to the surroundings environment. Now that body heat can't be stored and maintained. It basically goes into our atmosphere and it's lost. So that is energy loss in an ecosystem. Those bunnies or animals or any organism that eats plants, we call them consumers. They get eaten then by what we'd call a predator. So a predator like a fox or a human, or there's many others you can probably think of, but again, those also have body heat and they have energy loss to the environment. And we can continue this chain down and down and down. And we will do that when we talk about food webs. But the further this chain goes, the more and more body heat that's lost to the environment. So energy flows through the environment. It starts at the sun, gets stored in plants, and this is actually where a majority of the Earth's energy is at any one time. Then we have, as we go down this chain, it actually there's less and less energy. Okay, there's a lot more plants than there are humans. There's a lot more plants than there are fox. So, conversely, with nutrients, things like oxygen, nitrogen, water vapor, any other particles or molecules in our atmosphere or our Earth's crust. So nutrients cycle, they're recycled. So here's just a few examples. Earth's crust is made up of 46% oxygen, 28% silicon. Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, which is the part we breathe, and 2% water vapor, carbon dioxide, and a whole bunch of other things that are in the atmosphere. So these things all get cycled through, and I'm going to talk about some specific ones here later on, but here's kind of the overall view of this. Plants, let's start with there. So plants have these elements in them. When they get consumed by animals, animals now have these nutrients in them. Now we talked about how the energy can be lost from animals. The nutrients stay in the cycle. So the nutrients then get eaten and passed on to predators. Predators will eventually die, and they get decomposed, broken down by these microorganisms. So they go to these decomposers after they die, and then those recycle all of our carbon, all of our oxygen, all those things back into the environment, back to where plants can use them. think like a compost. A compost is where those decomposers can break down a lot of that old, dead organic matter. And the important thing about this is it's a closed loop. So this loop will continue to go through for nutrients. Energy, on the other hand, it flowed and it doesn't have that closed loop to it. So nutrients do have that closed loop. Here's the first example of a nutrient cycle. It's called the carbon cycle. So carbon's one of the most important elements to living organisms. I'm going to start with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because you've probably heard of that a lot. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from a lot of different places. One place that it comes from, which you're probably most familiar with, is factory emissions. Okay, so this might be, factories that have the smokestacks. It might be homes where you're burning off wood or oil or any other way to heat your house. Factory emissions, you could even include things like cars and automobiles in that emission category. Those kick off carbon dioxide that go into the atmosphere. Plants and animals also do this process called respiration. When they create energy for their bodies, okay, plants need energy also, just like we need energy. We give off carbon dioxide. That's what we breathe out, for example, when we exhale. Now that carbon dioxide then that's in the atmosphere undergoes a process called photosynthesis, which we saw before. The sun and the carbon dioxide combine to form plants. Okay, the plants actually take the carbon part of this to grow. So plants can grow from that, and then from plants you can see that those can either die and become fossils or fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal as an example, or animals can eat them. Again, those nutrients, that carbon part, gets cycled into the animal. The animal can then either respire or they die eventually and they become fossils. Okay, plants, again, they can become fossils or fossil fuels. Over millions of years, those fossil fuels become burnt and back into the factory emissions, and that process repeats. Okay, you can probably imagine where like firewood would fit in here also. So that's the carbon cycle. So carbon's one of the nutrients that is recycled in on our Earth, in our environment. The next one here is the water cycle. This one you're probably pretty familiar with, so I'll go through this quickly. I'm going to start with the accumulation point. This is like lakes, rivers, and oceans that have large bodies of water. Now what happens is those get filled up by surface and subsurface runoff. So when it rains or snows or those types of things, that stuff gets drained into lakes, rivers, and oceans. Once it's there, it evaporates and it condenses into clouds. Okay, another way clouds can form is through transpiration of plants. So plants give off little amounts of water. They can condense, or they can maybe kind of form up into a second cloud there. Then those two clouds can form and combine to make a storm cloud. A storm cloud that then produces the precipitation for that surface runoff, and the cycle just repeats over and over. So the water cycle is the second cycle that recycles nutrients in our environment. The third one, and the last one I'll talk about, is the nitrogen cycle. This is the one you're probably least familiar with. Nitrogen's very important for plants in our environments. Okay, they use it to do a lot of their daily cell functions. So I'm going to start with atmospheric nitrogen, because remember, that's 78% of our atmosphere. So atmospheric nitrogen mostly gets into plants through two different methods. One is fixation, which is usually done by a high energy source like lightning. Okay, you might not think of that as a really important part of a cycle, but it is. So it can go into the soil through that means, or it can go through the soil into next to the roots of the plant. And in either method, you can see that it interacts with this. This is a bacteria. So bacteria will change the nitrogen into a nitrate form. So you may have heard of nitrates. So nitrogen and nitrates are different things, but the nitrogen gets converted by bacteria in the soil into a means that the plant can use it. Another way that it might get to this point is dead animals or plants get decomposed, which produces ammonium, which is similar to ammonia very similar compound. That then gets passed into some bacteria, which also changes it back into nitrates, which allows the plant to absorb it and use it. So once that plant has those nitrogens in it, the nitrates that it needs, then animals can eat those plants sometimes, okay? And both of those get broken down into proteins. And we'll talk about the structures of proteins, but basically the proteins are a way to store the nitrogen. So nitrogen gets passed to the roots, to the tree, or the plant, okay? And those either produce proteins, or the animal eats it and they produce the proteins. Eventually those die. They get cycled back into the soil, and this cycle continues throughout. The other means is if the dead animals go through the decomposers to the ammonium, there's a second bacteria type which actually allows that nitrogen to go back into the atmosphere, which is good because we don't want all of our nitrogen in the soil, because we need that in our atmosphere to basically keep our planet warm and everyone happy. So that's the nitrogen cycle. So a few terms that you should know there as well. That concludes this lecture. So make sure you go on and take the short quiz here before you leave. There will just be a few questions on Google Classroom. Thanks.